And the thing I find most affirming about coming to programs like this is finding out that we all share the same problems at some level, but I think most of us actually are aspiring to do the right thing. The first thing you're going to see is, as my students often complain, I speak very, very quickly. Now, the good news is, in order to slow me down, Gary told me I could speak for 2 hours today. And so, in all seriousness, I'll go quite quickly. We can speak during lunch or throughout the course of the day. But lots of interesting themes. And before I even get to my slides, I think I can tell you almost everything that I was going to talk about, referring back to the many excellent presentations we've already had today. So, I want to start with Ron, because what Ron basically did was give you a perfectly rational, sensible solution to our problems, other than the fact that our procurement systems are typically driven by our legislatures, which are by nature irrational. So it would be a good way to do business in a perfect world, but we don't live in a perfect world, so we're up against the same problems. Secondly, what he and I were speaking about at the break, and this is very, very important, is that when we talk about procurement, understanding what you're trying to buy is really important. We were talking about the fact that the requirements generator, the ultimate customer, must communicate to the acquisition professional what they want to buy. Around the world, this is the weak link. So it really doesn't make any difference if your procurement system works if the requirements generator can't describe what they want that person to buy, and that's a huge problem for all of us. But again, we won't solve that one today. Alexandra gave an excellent description of the classic model that we all suffer in with public procurement. And I think he was quite frank in describing the fact that in Brazil, they started top-down, trying to solve the corruption problem first, and then designed a purchasing system that did not focus on outcomes like value for money and customer satisfaction. Yeah. This is pathological. It is also consistent with the behavior of all countries around the world. It's the most heartbreaking thing that we have to deal with. Okay, similarly, what you heard was a fixation on low price. Low price does not make sense as a metric, except with commodities, the kind of things that you might buy in a reverse auction. If we can't have a conversation about value for money and customer satisfaction, we are failing. And I challenge all of you later when I get to the government procurement agreement to find the words customer satisfaction in the government procurement agreement. Let's not get too depressed just yet. I want to say one thing that I loved Anna's first two slides, and what I particularly loved about them is she discussed stakeholders and she included the private sector. I have been all over the world and spoken to government and procurement officials and legislatures that design entire procurement systems with no regard whatsoever for the private sector. I was in Vietnam last summer. Days and days of speaking with the Vietnamese government. No contractors in the room. They don't care what the private sector thinks. They're just designing a procurement system. Who are they doing business with? This is one of the fundamental flaws that we all have to deal with. I was ecstatic to see that in there. It is the missing link for all of us. And then finally, one of the great things that Gary did when he was opening this morning is he talked about the reality that we are all doing business in global markets today. The interesting thing is that in our regimes, they are regimes created by governments, and guess what? Governments don't control globalization. They may think they can slow it down, they may think they can stop it or operate outside of it, but the harsh reality is we work with individual state regimes created by governments that have no control over globalization, and most don't want to acknowledge, let alone understand what the global supply chain means. All of which makes our challenge today quite complicated. Okay, so what I was going to talk about mostly today is an American perspective on a lot of these things. Look, I understand that we as Americans are not only unusual, weird, but we're obnoxious. We are who we are, but our system is different for a number of reasons. First and foremost, and particularly when you compare it to the EU, our procurement regime distinguishes what happens at our federal or central government, and we basically ignore everything subcentral. So our government has no input on what the states or the municipalities or the regions are going. We are flabbergasted by the EU's efforts or the government procurement agreement's efforts to basically tell subcentral governments how to do business. We're also quite cynical about their ability to do it, but that's another story. Okay, one of the other very unusual things about our system is our system is dominated by our Defense Department, which represents 2/3 of our annual procurement budget. But much more importantly, all of the major practices, all of the innovations, and most of the training comes out of defense. If you meet the most experienced public procurement officials in the United States, and I'll put myself in that group, we grew up working for the Defense Department and then we went to do other things. Why? Because the Defense Department buys the coolest stuff. I love things that go boom. It's really exciting. But the best training, the best experience, the best development is all in defense, whereas the rest of the world, by definition, excludes defense from procurement. So we are talking entirely different languages. Okay, this is very relevant to what Ron was talking about, and we talked about this a little bit at the break. This has changed in my professional lifetime. In the United States, our system is now today dominated by services. 2 out of every $3 we spent, services were nothing when I began in this business. But we are now an insatiable consumer of services because, like the rest of the world, we are engaged in outsourcing, which has a lot of ramifications, the biggest being our system was never designed to buy services. We never trained our professionals how to buy services. We don't know how to buy services, and we surely don't know how to manage them. And that's 2/3 of all the money we spend. Okay, supplies and goods, that's what we used to buy. We're actually pretty good at that. And then, of course, construction and public works, although keep in mind in the United States, we have yet to adopt the global definitions of works. In the United States, our statutory or legislative premise for procurement is that there must be an expenditure of appropriated funds. Therefore, we have historically exempted or accepted concessions. So, for example, bots and boots, we wouldn't call that a procurement because there's no government money being spent. So we are totally out of sync with the rest of the world in that conversation. All right, the best thing that we do in the United States, we have always talked about procurement cradle to grave. Requirements, planning, competition, contract award, and post-award contract management through contract closeout. I cannot understand regimes that basically believe that procurement ends when a contract is awarded. It is the single major failing in the government procurement agreement. If you believe you've accomplished something by awarding a contract, you and I have very little to talk about. I will measure your success when you've determined whether you've gotten value for money when it's all over. Okay, we are heavily regulated. If you take our federal acquisition regulation and drop it on your toe, you will be injured. It is a huge book, and we focus on, like everyone else, transparency, corruption control, and accountability. Arguably, we were a decade or two ahead of a lot of countries on that, but at the end of the day, we historically believe in competition, but I think we're ahead of most countries in terms of our flexibility. The two biggest examples of that I would give you is we are major proponents of negotiation rather than low price. In addition, we use a lot of cost reimbursement or flexibly priced agreements, which I believe are very cost effective. Having said that, and you heard this from a couple of people, we are the leaders in wealth distribution through public procurement. We believe, as much as we believe in the marketplace, our legislature has historically believed in the allocation of contracts to all kinds of groups. I'll talk more about this later, but whether it's small, disadvantaged, indigenous, or the like, we have numerous competing, inconsistent policies to allocate our contracts in a non-competitive fashion. And then, of course, the other one, the most exciting, our legislature cannot control itself. We are constantly in a change, in a system where we are changing and in upheaval. So it is impossible to ever understand the system because it literally changes almost every day. Okay, this is just a snapshot real quick on spending. Other than the European Union, our federal government is the single largest procurement system in the world. It's actually huge. But one of the strangest things that happened was in the last decade, we had an explosion in procurement spending, and it was all about outsourcing. It was all growth in services. But here's what I want you to look at. In our fiscal year 2000, at the federal procurement level, we spent about $220 billion purchasing stuff. By the time we got to 2008, we were up to over $530 billion. Think about this in terms of managing a process. During the last decade, our procurement spending went up at 5 times the rate of inflation. Now, I'll talk later about the fact that we did not increase our personnel at all during that period, and we were already understaffed, which suggests we had all kinds of problems. We're actually getting a small decrease or a plateau right now that's consistent with the economic troubles around the world. It'll be very interesting to see how it works out. But almost all of this growth was either driven by services or, of course, our expenditures in Iraq and Afghanistan, regardless of what you think about those. Okay. Now, we have three major challenges in addition to all of the normal challenges that we have in our system. The biggest one today is budgeting and contracting instability. We are in chaos right now. If you follow the American media, our president and our legislature are basically at odds over what to do about budgeting. We work in a one-year budget cycle, and the cycle is broken today. As I tell my students, the reason this is particularly important to us is when we talk about procurement, we're actually talking about contracts. And what's a contract? A contract is a bargain between two parties to basically control an economic event in the future. People enter into contracts so that they can achieve future certainty. If I cannot control how much money I have, my promise to pay you for something in the future is meaningless. So we're in total chaos right now. Our contractors are beside themselves. The overall level of tension is dramatic. It's not going to improve in the next year or two until we get our budget under control. One of the most troubling aspects of what happened in the last year, particularly in part due to contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan, what ended up happening in the United States, and this is rather complex, but quite briefly, the American public was not ecstatic with how things played out in Iraq or Afghanistan. And unfortunately, one thing that we learned in our country over the last 50 to 70 years was blaming the troops themselves isn't the solution. So the Americans wanted to be angry at somebody, and they didn't know who to be angry at, so they became angry at the contractors that were supporting our work in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is consistent with a reasonably recent phenomenon of outsourcing. But what's happened is our legislature and the media and the public in the last decade has become fundamentally anti-contractor. It is vogue, it is popular to trash contractors in the media. It's also unsophisticated and ignorant, but that really doesn't stop too many people, and it's not productive. But it really changes the dynamic because the government is basically under pressure to not treat their business partner fairly or rationally. There is the clear motivation to be abusive to the business partner, which in the long run is doomed to fail. All right, finally, and this is a thematic, you heard it subtly in all the other presentations today, but the main thing that I've come to conclude in my career in this field is that it's all about the people, okay? It's all about the people. We're experiencing unprecedented shortfalls in our acquisition workforce, our professional procurement staffs, and frankly, until about a decade ago, we believe we had the best trained, most experienced procurement professionals in the world because we'd been investing in it for a long time. Since 1989, or in other words, for more than 20 years, we have been gutting our acquisition workforce, and we did no succession planning until about 2008, and then it was too late, and now there's no money to fix it. So we don't have enough people. They're multinational. The biggest companies in the world, they're multinational. And when it's all said and done, the supply chain is multinational, and nobody in this room can do anything about it. Whether we like it or not, free trade facilitates the movement of capital, information, technology, and people. This is just the reality. Okay, now, against that backdrop, what's happened, and I think, frankly, more than anything, due to the internet, we have had in the last 20 years an unprecedented conversation about harmonizing public procurement. When I was a young procurement professional, there was no discussion about any procurement system outside the United States except for the World Bank system, which is somewhere between flawed and underdeveloped, okay? So we're not even talking about the World Bank system anymore, okay? But what's interesting is in the last 15 to 20 years, this global conversation has not just begun, it has accelerated at a frightening pace. Now, this is my personal opinion. Whether we like it or not, the winner in terms of norms has become the World Trade Organization's government procurement agreement. And they won through a fluke. They won originally because the major trading partners in the world are also most of the more developed economies. As I say, once China joins, the game's over, because India is going to come running in behind them, whether they want to or not. And frankly, Russia's already basically indicated they're in that direction. At that point, all of the major economies in the world are in. You either play or you don't. Now, we can talk later about what it means to be part of the GPA. But in terms of the global vernacular, best practices, terminology, and approach to systems, this rather flexible platform is becoming the starting point. What's interesting about it is it was not so long ago, for example, the OECD had the high ground. What direction did they come from? Corruption control, corruption control, corruption control. They came out with their A to Z document on procurement almost 10 years ago. The OECD now is increasingly irrelevant except for technical assistance. All right, the United Nations, the UNCITRAL model law. I say this with some reservations because my colleague has just spent the last decade of his life working on the new edition. The bottom line is it's becoming increasingly irrelevant. It's a wonderful tool for extremely underdeveloped nations to not have to start from scratch, but that's not where they're going. The fact that so much of the document is focused on frameworks and reverse auctions indicates that there's a total disconnect between starting from scratch and going to sophisticated electronics. So it's a wonderful tool. It's excellent leisure reading. I think it's increasingly irrelevant. Okay. The EU model, on the other hand, is incredibly important because when I first started doing law transfer not so many years ago, people would bring in speakers and they would compare what's the United States doing, what are they doing in Europe, and the like. But I think that the EU directives made a choice that will eventually lead to regret. Now look, you got to keep in mind, I live in a country where a small group of states decided to come together to do something like the EU's doing at a different time and in a different place. But when I read the EU directives, I read about minimum standards, not best practices, not aspirations, not outcomes. In the long run, that's not a way to regulate the process, and I believe eventually that model will be cast aside. The frightening thing amongst all this is we see the proliferation of bilateral arrangements. My favorite example, of course, is Chile. If you don't know anything about Chile and public procurement, they own the record for the greatest number of multilateral and bilateral agreements. Why they don't just join the GPA, I don't know. They fully qualify, but I think their trade people like traveling around and making deals. The problem with that is every time they change the law, they have to rewrite 50 trade agreements. It's insane. I don't control it. But in any event, so this is all happening. And the best part about this is we can all speak the same languages. 20 years ago when you said tender, I didn't know what you were talking about because I talk about bids and proposals and offers. The global nomenclature and best practices are becoming agreed upon, and whether we like it or not, this will become the template. The second edition is better than the first. The problem is it's not flexible enough to be changed every 2 or 3 years, but again, that's where we're going. All right, now, a few examples in terms of just the United States versus the rest of the world and how we deal with all these global issues. As I suggested before, we, like all other countries, are incredibly inconsistent in terms of what we say externally and internally. So, for example, on the one hand, we are the world's leading proponent of free trade. On the other hand, we are the world's leading proponent in supporting domestic manufacture. You figure it out. Okay? We are the one whose model you all used to come up with your domestic preference regimes. Okay? But by the same token, we're an original with the WTO's GPA. Similarly, you've heard a lot of discussion about this morning. We have so many preference and unique wealth distribution regimes, you can't even keep track of them. Our classic one is for small business, but we now have them for women-owned business, minority business, veteran business, areas of high unemployment, and of course, indigenous populations. And I haven't even gotten to environmentally preferable purchasing or sustainable development. But my all-time favorite one is if you really analyze how complex this has become, if you read our program on women-owned business, it's not really a preference program for women-owned small business. It's a preference for white women-owned small businesses. But you couldn't say that in public. But if you were, for example, an African-American woman-owned business, you would rather be under the minority program because it's a better program. Imagine the fact that in the United States of America, we have a statutory preference program for white women-owned business. That's unbelievable if you think about it. So in any event, we've lost control. The one point I want to make on all this, and I think it's actually quite important, no one has proven that any of these programs work. They are masters of inefficiency. I have yet to have an economist sit down, look me in the eye with a straight face, not burst out laughing, and telling me that the price premiums are worth it. Now, I would be open to any study you want, but as I consistently tell our legislatures, you want to help women-owned business? Lend them money, give them training, do anything that actually helps them. These programs are objectively arbitrary, and in effect, they are sledgehammers where you should be using a scalpel. So I tell this story all over the world. Nobody listens because legislatures feel that they have to do these things. Okay, next. Like the rest of the world, we are overly focused on corruption control. My favorite line when I speak to our legislatures is, I can tell you how to eliminate fraud in contracting. It's called state-owned enterprise. Stop entering into contracts and you'll have no fraud. Obviously, that's not a solution, okay? There are going to be problems, and if you make the system so inefficient, here is an example where we can quantify the price premiums. We pay between 15 to as much as 50% of every dollar we spend trying to control things that are basically being overly regulated. And now the biggest fear, since we're talking about the global economy, our firms fear liability under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, performing small contracts in third world countries where they have to deal with the kind of agents and partners that Anna was talking about earlier. This is very, very difficult stuff. And then, of course, some other issues that we can talk about later. In a global economy with partners and basically the acquisition of different firms, we also have concerns about foreign ownership of significant technologies and industries that we need in the United States. And maybe the most interesting one today is counterfeit parts. Particularly, we're talking about remanufactured computer chips coming out of China in our supply chain. That's a problem for everyone in the world today. All right, now, very simple observations. You've probably already figured all of these out by now. The first is the problem today in the world in procurement is not writing a good law. There's plenty of good laws. You could borrow one anyway, okay? The problem is all about implementation, and implementation is all about people. I don't want to pick on China, and I wish Ping was already here, and you'll hear from Ping this afternoon, but he and I were just in China together, I guess a summer ago. I use the China example because it's instructive. When China decided in 1998 that they were going to write a new procurement law, they did more research than any country ever has. I first went to China in 1998 with some others, and we worked with them literally for 4 years in addition to many other countries. They published a law. We went back in 2002 when they wrote the new law. One of my all-time favorite conference moments. We're there at the Ministry of Finance, people from all over the world. They roll out their new law. You read the new law and it makes sense. I make the mistake of answering the question, you have this nice new law now. Who's going to do all of this? No phase-in period whatsoever. The new law becomes effective. As a nation in 2002, the Chinese people did not even understand what the concept of contract meant as a nation. The plan, which was announced at the meeting, is China was going to train 10,000 people a year indefinitely to learn how the new law was going to work. My feeling is you should start small, implement what you can, and grow from there. But their capacity problem is the same as everyone else's. Two quick examples that I have seen in different countries where governments simply are unqualified to do what needs to be done in this field. Look, I was talking to some other people about this morning. One of the fundamental problems in most countries is that procurement officials come from public policy schools, come from government backgrounds, and they don't have economics and business experience. It's a fact of life. Two skills, market research. If you don't know how to do market research, you have no idea what you're buying. I was flabbergasted in Vietnam just last summer. I'm sitting there having a conversation with the elite of the Vietnamese public procurement officials. I'm talking about market research, and they say, but how am I supposed to do market research? If I'm buying an electrical generator, you tell me I'm supposed to survey industry. How do I know what industry can do? I said, hand me your computer, okay? Well, just like anything else that you buy, in 5 minutes, I was able to show them exactly what they should be paying per kilowatt dollar for an electrical generator. They were flabbergasted. But imagine you're in a third world or a developing country, and you didn't grow up in an internet-savvy world. How do you do market research? Doing market research in the global economy today is wonderful, but only if you know how. Similarly, government officials, as a general rule, are poorly trained in business negotiation, and since contracts are business partnerships, if you can't negotiate, you can't manage a contract. I don't need to say anything else about that. You understand the fundamental problem that we have. Okay, I have a few slides that I'm going to throw up here. I understand people will be around for the rest of the day if anybody wants to talk about any of these things. The first, a few websites, because you might find them interesting and you can look at them earlier. Anna showed you the single point of entry for Russian procurement. We now have one for the United States. Great web name, www.acquisition.gov. Took us a lot of years to get there, but that's pretty good. They've got information on everything there. It's a little bit over the top, but there's great information there. Our uniform regulation is called the Federal Acquisition Regulation, acquisition.gov/FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulation. I'm a big fan of data, and I'm a big fan of understanding markets. We publish more data than any country in the world. I'm not sure it's all accurate, but it's getting better all the time. Our new improved site is called usaspending.gov. It is a data-rich and facile device, much better than our old federal procurement data system, which still works, by the way. And then at our law school, we have a pretty developed program here, lots of different ideas there, and you might be interested in looking at that as well. A couple other things very briefly. I threw up a couple articles that my colleagues and I have written in the past, not necessarily because you may or may not want to read these articles. But here's the one thing I want you all to pay attention to if you only write down one thing before I'm done here. Social Science Research Network, JEL code H57. The Social Science Research Network is free. It's on the internet. And in my experience today, until we figure out a better solution, this is the easiest way in the world to share knowledge on procurement. So if you go to SSRN, stick in H57, you'll find about 250 articles of different length, different topics, all related to public procurement. They have another JEL code on outsourcing and privatization, and you'll find that eventually. But if you're writing in the field, put your stuff up on SSRN. Until we come up with a better way to share, for my money, this is the best free global tool that we have. All right, the last thing I wanted to mention, since I talked about this capacity issue, and it's kind of interesting based on what we were talking about last night at dinner. I first did a version of this slide for a talk in Brazil a number of years ago. When developing countries say, but what do we need in terms of human capacity, or human capital or capacity? What do we really need for an effective procurement system? I think this is the list, but let's be honest. This is a really daunting list. What you basically need is experienced people to come up with good rules, deal with this requirement issue we talked about before. You have to write good contracts, and then you have to negotiate them. Then you have to manage them and provide oversight, and you have to have good training. And in addition, you basically need your private industry and an open media to make the thing work. This is asking a lot. Very few nations can do this, and we're not even close, and I think we're in better shape than most. But for everybody on this list, the real heartbreaker is how much you have to invest in them, and that's where this comes in. Most countries can't get enough people, and if they can get enough people, they never get them developed enough before they leave to go to the private sector. You have to find them, you have to recruit them, and then you have to get them working in the right positions. You not only have to educate them, they have to learn by experience. I agree with those people that say no one should be able to write a request for proposals or a request for tenders unless they've written a proposal or a tender. Until you do that, how do you know? And most government people don't have that experience. I'm a big fan of rotational assignments with the private sector. You need people to make independent business judgments. That's hard. You have to make it worth their while. What happens? Most people work for the government. They realize they can make more money in the private sector. They're gone. Those are the people that we want to keep. So you have to develop them and keep them. And at the same time, as a community, we need to do better with regard to professional standards and, of course, professional ethics. I apologize that I spoke too quick. I look forward to talking to all of you later. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks.